Test one. The only problem we have is if he does this, he's going to need to be heard. So, sure. If we want to do this, how can we do this and write at the same time? Here we get.
Let's ask him. He goes, Mark.
Use it when you do the board. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, and again. Test one. Yeah, yes. Yeah, wherever you need it, you can put
Wherever you
it.
feel comfortable.
Yep.
You want
We're
this?
gonna use that one for support. I mean, that one for support.
Yeah, I may not need it, but it just depends on how.
Yeah, but we can leave the mic here if it's easier for you to grab, or right
Oh,
up
that
here.
would, right here.
Okay, and it's on, so.
Okay. As long as it's done in-
There will be
Be careful
feedback.
with that. don't wanna
I won't
trip
get
on
dual,
that
will I? You want me to test it?
Is there feedback if you got both of them on?
thing. I don't know yet.
Yeah, we'll find out.
I can turn it off here.
Okay.
You can just leave the mic on and I can turn it off here.
Okay.
Turn the podium on right now.
Yeah, Bill.
I don't have any feedback.
You getting feedback?
Not yet. We'll know when we get there.
Testing.
afternoon, and welcome to a Utility Advisory Committee workshop. So we're having a workshop today and not a regular meeting. We're looking at a rate presentation. But I guess we have some of the similar aspects. We will go ahead and confirm the posting and the roll call. If they could. And we have everybody except for Howard Nail today. So we have a quorum. So we'll go ahead and do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, so we will do a quick public, we'll see if there's any, so I see there's two in the audience, but I don't think there's, but is there any comments from the audience? Okay, and was there any phone or email, Josh? Okay, so we'll just take we'll go to the phone calls real quickly, 702-589-9629. We're just gonna, there will be another comment at the end if we go through here too quickly or miss it, but we're not gonna spend I won't wait too long on this one. Well, actually, I don't doubt there's that much comment on a presentation, actually. So I think there is a lag time, but I doubt that we're going to hear from anybody right away. So we'll give the tail end, we'll give the last comment period just a little bit longer. So let's go ahead and close out the comment period. And we'll go to the agenda item. We just have the one agenda item today. Presentation by Mark Beckham, President of Utility Financial Solutions, LLC, providing presentation related to financial planning and cost of service studies for utilities. Was there anything you wanted to start with, Joe?
No, I think you got it. Thank you.
Okay. So as usual, if we can ask questions along the way then, just to make sure that's not a problem. I think it's been stated, but I'll just make it for everybody else. Always makes it easier. So anytime, Mark, you're ready, then we're ready to, any comments from the committee before we start? Okay. I guess I'll make one comment, maybe as we can get to the first thing, but I looked at, and I did talk to Mark a little bit, as I went through the package, I think without derailing everything, if we can sort of get where it fits best, if it's in the beginning or a little bit later, sort of an outline, a little more of an outline of a regular standard rate process.
Okay.
Because I'm seeing here these are definitions, but I think it seems like it's sort of missing a little steps. If I'm
It is. It's a high level.
Correct.
And I'll try to fill them in.
So if that's okay with everybody, I think that would just gives us more idea what we would be expecting, and it might help us to make sure we understand what needs to go in the RFP. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to discuss oops, how do I do this? Oh, there we go. Got it. What I'm here to discuss is financial planning and cost of service and rate design for utilities. In other words, how to appropriately determine revenue requirements for utilities and how to do the financial planning and how you assess the financial stability of a utility. The second part of what I'm going to discuss is what's called a cost of service study. A cost of service study looks at who's causing certain costs to be incurred, and I'll get into that in some detail. The last part of it is a rate design, and prior to the rate design, that's where the governing body comes into play to get your input into the rate designs as to what the community objectives are. Now, before I get, what did I do wrong? There we go. I want to tell you a little bit about myself and our company. My name is Mark Beauchamp. I'm president of Utility Financial Solutions. I started the company in 2001, and right now we do about 16% of all the public power systems in the United States. We've done work in 46 states, including the islands of Guam, Barbados, Bermuda, and in the Caribbean. We teach the cost of service courses and the financial planning courses for the American Public Power Association, and we've written numerous articles. Now, myself personally, I have a strange background. I have a degree in water purification technology. I actually hold a Class A license in wastewater treatment, it's the highest you can get. I also have a degree in accounting, and I'm a CPA, and I have a master's degree in business with a focus on economics. So, what I'm going to talk about again is I'm going to start with financial planning. And this kind of outlines the 3 steps that are involved in a rate study, okay? As I mentioned, the very first step is the financial planning. And financial planning, I'll get into the details, but it looks at where you are today and where you're going to be 5 years into the future, every year, all right? To assess the financial stability of the utility. And we'll get into the key financial targets that we look at. The second part is a cost of service study, which normally a cost of service study is not something that utilities need to do every year. Financial planning is something they should. They should do it as part of the budget process. They should continuously update those financial plans. But the cost of service study every 3 to 5 years, because costs don't change that significantly on a year-to-year basis. And unless there's something major changing, like a new power supply contract or major investments in the distribution system, usually every 3 to 5 years is significant enough. Then the rate design. As I mentioned in this, that's the art part of the whole process. It's part art and part science. The cost of service study tells you what the ideal rates are for the average customer within each class, the class being residential, commercial demand. All right. So, but every community has certain objectives they want to achieve. Some may be environmental, some may be social objectives, but in the rate design process, we review with the governing body the financial modeling and the cost of service and take that input before we do the rate design. Because one of the things you don't want to do in a rate design is, let's say you are planning a 5% rate increase. You don't want to design rates with a 5% increase and have some customers go up 20%. So you want to minimize the impacts as much as possible. And that's part of that rate design process and part of the input that we're looking for from the governing body. What is the maximum adjustments that we're willing to deal with, in a sense? If we have a 5% range, do we want to put a bandwidth around it of a plus or minus 2%, which means that no rate increase will go up more than 7%, and the minimum increase would be 3%. We work within that range to design the rates. And that's the input we're looking for from the governing body. Now, I'm going to get into the key financial targets. There are 3 key financial targets that we look at. There's many other financial targets that we review, but there's 3 main ones. The first one is debt coverage ratio. And debt coverage ratio is most utilities have outstanding debt. And oftentimes it's through what's called revenue bonds. Not general obligation, but revenue bonds. And revenue bonds are secured by the revenues of the utility. And when those types of bonds are issued, which is most electric utilities, then the ordinance that specifies the bond prospectus says that the utility has to maintain a certain coverage ratio. And if they fall below that coverage ratio, they're in technical default in the debt. So the very first thing that we look at is how do we look in relationship to our debt coverage ratios that we're required to maintain? Because we have to make sure that those are exceeded, in a sense. Then we look at cash reserves. How much cash does the utility need to maintain at a minimum in their reserves? And utilities have what's called a working capital lag, which is a timing difference between when they pay the bill and get the money from customers. It's traditionally about 45 days. But then you also have your capital improvement plan. You want to make sure that your capital improvement plan, that you have enough money in reserve to fund your capital improvements for that year. All right, and then there's also unexpected things that can occur. Unexpected events could be, not here you wouldn't have an ice storm, but up in Michigan we would. Windstorm, earthquake, something that can cause major catastrophic event damage to the utility, or it could be something as unexpected as a transformer failing. So we want to make sure that you have enough cash and reserves to fund those unexpected events. And if a major catastrophic event occurred, that we have enough cash and reserves to start the repair and replacement process until adequate funding can be reserved. I'm going to get into detail on each one of these. So those first two, the debt coverage ratio and the minimum level of cash, that defines the increase at the smallest increase that we can do, because we have to keep rates, or we have to keep our targets above those minimum levels, okay? Determining revenue requirements is not an exact science. And what I mean by that is all we can do is determine a range. We have to maintain a coverage ratio. We have to maintain a certain level of cash reserves. We also create an upper boundary. In other words, that we don't want our rates to exceed. And that's called an operating income, or a target or optimal operating income. You may find this unusual what I'm going to say next, but even though we're a non-for-profit utility, we have to make money to break even. And the reason we have to make money is because when you put an asset in service, let's say it's $1 million asset with a 20-year life, every year you depreciate that asset basically to recover that $1 million. So at the end of 20 years, you theoretically recovered $1 million, but it's going to cost you more than that to replace it, because every year the replacement cost of the asset increases, which should be funded through the rates, because customers are using it and consuming that asset should pay for the replacement cost of that asset for the future. So that becomes our upper boundary. We don't like to exceed it, because if we do, then we're overcharging customers. Now, as I go through this, please stop me at any point and ask whatever questions you may have. The first one is debt coverage ratio. Now, you're a debt-free utility, Joe said, which is very unusual. Electric doesn't owe any debt. I don't believe water does either.
There is a small amount of water debt on the raw water line.
Okay.
That's the 30-inch steel line. That's the only municipal debt.
Yeah. And also none in the wastewater system, which is highly, again, very unusual. But if something major happened or a major improvement was needed and you have to issue debt, you typically have to go and get a rating from a bond agency. And that rating that you get is going to determine the interest rate that you pay. So you want to make sure that you have good financials so that you get a good rating, so you can keep the interest rates as low as possible to keep your rates lower. But the debt coverage ratio is really nothing more than the amount of cash that's generated through operations divided by your debt service payment. Utilities that have outstanding debt have to maintain a minimum coverage of typically 1.2 or 1.25. In other words, you have to generate 25% more cash through your operations than what your debt service payment is. And if you have traditional revenue bonds, if you fall below that, you're in technical default on the debt. Now, some utilities may issue general obligation bonds, which might be something you're more familiar with. General obligation bonds work differently. General obligation bonds are secured by the property taxes of the community. So they typically don't come with any coverage requirements. Where revenue bonds are secured by the revenues of the utility, and so they have more stringent requirements than general obligation. The reason most utilities don't issue general obligation bonds is because the city can only issue so much general obligation. They're limited by the property taxes or property values of the community. And if an electric utility were to use the general obligation bonds, it would use up all the bonding capacity of the community. So that's why utilities typically rely on revenue bonds. That makes sense?
Well, the one thing, just to make sure, I didn't see it here, so if you're gonna explain it later, let me know. But the one, make sure the committee remembers or understands that we have at least 3 reserves that should help with what you're discussing. We have the maintenance reserve, we have I just went brain dead, sorry. A rate reserve, just to cover rate issues,
Rate
most likely
stabilization.
power or water costs to go up. Actually, that's what it's related to. And then we have a 20% reserve for each utility.
Okay.
That's already established and already funded.
I did look at your financials. If I remember correctly, it looked like from a financial standpoint, cash basis, I believe you were in pretty good shape on a cash basis standpoint.
Yeah, the biggest thing is we still have quite a bit of, so not to go off track, but we have quite a bit of capital that has to be done. So a lot of that cash is associated with capital. It still has to be done.
Yeah.
So that has to be considered. So in a rate process, that all needs to be done. But I just want to make sure that, I believe we're within those boundaries right now. And so theoretically, we wouldn't have to collect much, if any, more to establish that. And that's what happened actually in the, I think it was the 2016 rate, was they did increase the rate to help fund the reserves.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, that's where the financial modeling comes in, because when you look out multi-years into the future and you add in your capital plans, it shows what's going to happen to cash. And one of the things that, and I'm going to get into cash, I think, on the next slide here. Actually, because this isn't that important, I'm going to go into the minimum cash. But one thing with cash is if your cash levels, say your minimum cash that you want to maintain is at this level, and you're oh, that's right. I'm not going to be able to no, thank you. And if your cash reserves are up at this level, and you look out into the future, and because you have a lot of capital expenditures, it's drawing down your cash reserves. And once oftentimes they'll fall below that minimum. And so what has to happen if you don't look out in the future is you have to reverse this negative cash burn that's occurring here and get yourself back above the minimum. That's typically when large rate adjustments occur. That's why the projections become so important, because it tells you when this is going to happen so that you can start planning for it here to smooth that out in the future. Does that make sense? Well, I'll try to avoid it. All right. So as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to cash, and the reasons why we need to maintain cash reserves, is the catastrophic events that I mentioned. Changes in power supply cost. You're not, you are in a very unique situation in you have extremely low power costs compared to the rest of the world, basically, and more stable. But you still have some volatility and some exposure to the market, but it's very limited. Most utilities have a substantial amount of exposure. But by having adequate cash reserves, any volatility or changes that occurs in that part of the market that you're exposed, if it jumps up, you want to make sure you have adequate cash to buffer that so you don't have to immediately increase rates for customers. So the cash reserves helps to smooth and stabilize the rates for customers. And that's one of the main things. A lot of things when I first got into consulting, the questions a lot of times from the board of directors or the governing body was, that's our customers' money. It's better for them to hold it than for us. And that is a philosophy that some use, but it tends to get them in trouble because it is their customers' money, but you're using it to stabilize their rates. All right, so that they don't have that volatility in their charges on an annual basis. So there is a certain level of cash that you need to maintain, but by doing that, you're stabilizing the rates, actually helping customers and keeping the rates lower in the future, because if you did give it back, then that graph that I put on, where the cash reserves go down, then when you go to increase rates, you're going to end up with a larger rate adjustment. So this is actually the graph of what I was showing on the slide, or trying to draw. But traditionally what happens when utility has adequate amounts of cash is expenses go up. But because they have adequate cash reserves, they don't adjust the rates. So the need for that increase typically doesn't go away. It just continues to compound and gets worse. So if you look at this, not working, the blue line, if your expenses are going up, then you're going to start drawing down on your cash reserves. Same thing was with the capital. And then once the cash reserves get down to a critical level, that's usually when utilities, municipal utilities, tend to increase rates. And that's why you see a lot of times 20, 30, 40% rate increases in water and wastewater. And it's primarily driven because they've allowed themselves to get into this situation. So when we do studies, for our studies, for example, part of it is we determine what that minimum level of cash should be, what the cash reserves that are needed by the utility. How much is that working capital leg reserve? How much is needed? How much do they need to set aside for capital, for catastrophic events, debt service payments, if there is any? And so we quantify what those factors are to determine what that minimum level should be. So this is just one of a sample that we put together. And like operation maintenance cost is traditionally between 12 and 25% of O&M expenses. To determine the minimum, we add up these 5 factors. Power supply cost, we look at the maximum power supply cost that a utility incurs throughout the year. We want that in our reserves at all times. All right. Then to try to identify unexpected events, it's not something that can be directly quantified. It's something that we have to recognize that these unexpected events can occur. So, for example, what we do is we look at the infrastructure and we look at the age of the infrastructure. And if the system is, the average utility across the United States, about 50% depreciated, makes total sense. If your system is 60% depreciated, that means it's an older infrastructure, more exposed to unexpected events. So we assign it a higher risk rating than if it's a newer infrastructure. And I didn't look to see where you're at on that. Then your annual debt service payment, we want that in your reserves. And then we look at your 5-year capital improvement plan that's funded from cash, and we use an average of the 5 years total capital improvement plan. When we sum that up, that tells us what the minimum level of cash should be. Is there any questions about this before I go to the next target?
I guess just the fact that everybody understands that Boulder City does have certain factors already in place, and so during the rate process, that needs to be covered and reviewed and make how that fits into the overall process.
Mm-hmm.
The rate reserve and the maintenance reserve are done a little differently than what because they're for specific aspects.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I guess I need to understand more is that I believe that Silver State actually has a reserve for us also in the power costs, because we pay a budget, we don't pay as it goes. And so my understanding is a reserve has been already developed.
Yeah.
And so those are things that we just make sure everybody's aware of, so we don't increase a rate to cover a reserve we don't need.
Correct,
Because
absolutely.
to make sure there's not a misunderstanding.
Yeah. You know, one of the things, the advantage of actually having an approved policy is it identifies why you need certain levels of cash and why you need to maintain certain levels of cash. Because oftentimes, take like an electric utility, their need for cash is probably greater than the entire general fund of the city multiple times over. And so the policy helps to identify and help people to understand why the utilities need to maintain certain levels of cash reserves. That's one of the biggest benefits of it. Plus, when it usually has provisions that if you fall below the minimum level, how to recover from that and what period of time the governing body needs to take to get the cash reserves back above the minimums. All right, so there's benefits to having an actual policy. Right. So the target operating income, now this is that upper boundary I mentioned. You know, we have to set rates high enough to meet coverage ratio, high enough to maintain a certain level of cash reserves. But the upper boundary becomes this targeted operating income, which really reflects the inflationary increase in the replacement cost of the assets you have in service. Every year they change, and that's what we're trying to recover through an operating income. And that's also why we have to make money to break even. So if you look at what we use to determine this is the Handy-Whitman Index, which tells us how electric infrastructure costs have changed over a certain period of time. And we usually use a 20-year average. Now, anybody who's been, you know, if you're familiar with what's happened in the last few years in electric infrastructure costs, they've gone up 8, 9, 10% or more, actually. Transformers like 40 or 50, I think. So that's part of the reason why we use that rolling average from the Handy-Whitman Index, to try to keep that rate of return number kind of stable. But most municipals maintain a rate of return between 4 and 7%. And what that, if you wanted to calculate that, which I have a slide coming up to show you, I guess I don't. Sorry about that. But what it is if you look at the records, the assets, you have historical investment in infrastructure. Let's say hypothetically it's $20 million. And you look at accumulated depreciation. Let's say that's $10 million. That means you have a net book value of 10 million. 20 minus a 10 is 10. That 4 to 7% applies to that $10 million. So if you're at a 4% rate of return requirement, that means you need to have cash reserves of 400, or target operating income of $400,000. All right, that makes sense, and that represents the inflationary increase in the assets replacement cost. But that becomes our upper boundary. We don't want to exceed it. And the reason is if we exceed that, then we are in fact overcharging customers. So we want to cap it at that, and we develop that range. Believe me, if revenue requirements was, if you could determine it with exactness, it would make my job a lot easier, but you really can't. All you can do is define that range. So once you get these pieces together, and you look at debt coverage ratio and cash reserve requirements and what your upper boundary or target operating income is, now all of a sudden you can develop a plan. A plan looking forward over the next, say, 5 years. And what that plan does is it says we need to adjust rates at this level to maintain our debt coverage ratios or our cash reserves. And to try to look, because it may show that if you don't do anything with rates, in year 5, we need to have a 10% increase. Well, that, to have rates stable for 4 years and all of a sudden a big jump, typically customers don't like that. So it's best to have small periodic adjustments of, say, 2% each year to keep the utility financially stable and avoid that 10% adjustment. This is an example of a utility that the base case without any rate adjustments. And if you look, it's a 5-year projection. If you look over at debt coverage ratio, this utility has to maintain a minimum coverage ratio of 1.4. This is way on the right-hand side. And you see in year 1, without any rate changes, they're still going to meet that. It isn't until year 5 that they actually fall below that minimum debt coverage ratio requirement. Cash reserves for this utility. The minimum requirement's about 40 million, a little over 40 million. You can see in year 1 they're a little below it at 35 million, but they're in a cash burn situation. So every year the cash is going down. So they're already below the minimum and they're in that cash burn situation. So basically in year 5 they're going to run out of money. All right. Now the operating income, which is in the middle, says adjusted operating income. The upper boundary, or the target, is about $10 million. And you can see that in year 1, they're actually operating at a loss of $1 million, and every year the operating loss is getting bigger. This is without any rate changes. So, in this picture, it looks like a pretty bad picture, right? But when you look at what it would take to fix it, it's pretty small. Because when you start with just modest 2.8% adjustments, what happens is that coverage ratio on the right is well above the 1.4. Minimum cash is exceeded. And you're working toward that upper boundary or adjusted operating income with modest 2.8% adjustments. So and that's how the financial modeling works for utilities. When that's what's critical or what's important are the benefits when you do a long-term projection, because it tells you how you can adjust rates to minimize rate impacts on customers, rather than all of a sudden you go to do the budget and because you're only looking out 1 year at a time, and then all of a sudden looking we're going to run low on cash reserves and we have to increase rates. And all of a sudden it can be a large adjustment that's needed. So, before I get into cost of service, and I leave the financial modeling or financial projection piece, is there any questions about it? This is the most important piece. This is more important than the cost of service, in my opinion, because it identifies what the adjustments or changes are needed in revenue requirements to keep the utility financially stable. And it's the easiest part of the study, actually.
But I guess the one question I might have, how long does it take to gather the information to get an accurate picture of that?
Usually, the hardest thing, the financials are already there. Usually you ask the accounting department, they send you a PDF or an output of their trial balance. And usually we use usually 3 or 4 or 5 years. We also look at the audits. That's part of it's pretty easy. The more difficult piece on the financial side is the capital plan. Sorry if there's any engineers in the room, but what happens with the engineering department is they know the capital that's needed, the assets that need to be replaced, but so they look at it and it does need to be replaced, but they tend to front load the capital. So what ends up happening is you end up with large capital needs in the early part of the projection and lower needs in the back part. And the reality of it is it's probably, it's going to be carryover from year to year. So, but that's the hardest piece to get, is usually the capital plan. And usually there's sensitivity that we run, sensitivity analysis. And what I mean by that is, as I mentioned, they don't really know exactly when this capital is going to be incurred or how much it's actually going to cost if it's a really large project. So then we start running sensitivities like, okay, if you're planning a $5 million improvement in this substation, but you need to make it larger, it's going to cost $10 million, how is that going to affect the financials? So it's a very easy, once these models are built, just to change the assumptions.
What happens if you have a crazy year of inflation? Is that all going to be covered in your minimum cash reserves, or are you
Yep.
going to just raise?
Can you repeat that, please, with your mic on?
Oh,
Sorry.
what happens if you have a crazy year of inflation? I mean, obviously, the cost of capital improvements is going to go up. The labor's going to go up. Is that all absorbed by your minimum reserve, or do you have a plan for that, or how does that work?
I'm smiling. The reason I'm smiling is because when you do these 5-year projections, based on our history, when we look out 1 or 2 or even 3 years, we tend to be pretty close. But the only thing I'm certain of when I look out in year 4 and 5 is that I'm going to be wrong. And it's because of the things that you said, inflation changing. And yes, having adequate cash reserves allows the utility to buffer it until we can adjust rates, because it allows them to have that buffer. That's part of what I was referring to when, by utility holding cash, that they're holding it for the benefit of the ratepayers, and because we can now use that cash to buffer those cost changes like that. A cost of service study. A cost of service study, when you do a rate study, this is the heaviest lift, so to speak, of the study. And because it involves not just, after you determine the revenue requirements and the financial projections, now you need to identify how these costs should be split between the different classes. And in order to do that, you have to look at, okay, if your peak demands are occurring at 7 o'clock in the evening, you have to look at who's using energy at 7 o'clock in the evening. That's creating those peaks. That's causing you to have to enlarge your distribution system, your transformers, You're all the way back to having to purchase more generation capacity. All right, or because part of your energy is purchased from the market, are the market prices higher at 7 o'clock in the evening? All of that gets factored in. So we have to bring in what's called load research. And what load research is it develops load patterns for the different customer classes. In other words, a traditional residential load pattern. And like if you have AMI, we can get that data relatively easy. Shouldn't say it that way. It's not always that easy. But that will give us the hourly usage profile for every customer in your system, but you don't have that. Do you have SCADA data of your substations?
We do at the substations, yes.
So when we don't have that, what we fall back on is traditionally what's called SCADA data. And what SCADA information is, the feeders off of your substation has hourly interval data. And so if we could identify then feeders that primarily serve certain types of customers, such as residential, then we develop our load profile from that SCADA information. All right, and we do that same thing for commercial. Industrials, because they're larger customers, tend to have demands, which gives us a peek into the load profile. But sometimes they even have hourly recording meters on these larger customers already. But that is the heaviest lift, is that load research. But once we do we identify what these expenses are and the usage patterns, we develop the allocators to allocate what's called demand-related cost, energy, and customer-related cost. And what that is, the difference between those. First of all, customer-related cost. And are costs that are specifically attributable to customers. In other words, how much it costs to send a bill, for example. That goes into the customer-related cost. Energy-related costs would be the energy that you're purchasing. All right? Demand-related costs are infrastructure for your distribution system. For example, you have a transformer that serves like 3 to 5 residential homes. Who's using that transformer, and how much transformer infrastructure is there to serve or is needed to serve the residentials? The same thing for commercial and the larger commercials. All that relates all the way to the substation transformers and eventually to the power supply. Those are what goes into what's called a demand-related component or capacity-related component. Demand and capacity are traditionally one and the same. Does that make sense? And that then tells us how much it costs to serve each of the classes. This is an output of one of the examples. So like residential for this utility is the cost of service study says it should be $3.3 million. The projected revenues are $3 million. So theoretically, to meet cost of service, they would need a 9% increase. If you look at the bottom, the total line, the system needs ideally about a 1.2% increase. So what this is telling me is the residentials need a larger increase than the system average. So let's say this is your data, and it's not, of course. But let's say I bring this to you, and I say, okay, I recommend that, or we need a 1% increase, okay? How much should the residentials go up? That's where the governing body comes in and says, well, we're willing to put a bandwidth around it of a plus or minus 2%, which means that the largest increase is going to be 3% in any class, and the lowest increase would be a -2. So in this example, the residentials would probably go up 3%. All right, and then you get into like primary demand, they might go down to 2%. But you can see how this gives us the indication on how to move rates. You do not want to charge 100% cost of service based rates. There isn't a utility in the country that does. They couldn't do it if they wanted to, because your cost of service changes every year, at least to some degree. So even though you're trying to constantly move toward cost of service, it's not that you ever really want to get there. You just continue the process for fairness to move closer, while you're still considering those customer impacts.
Now, when you're doing the cost of service, I think it's more in the rate design, but make sure before we go past this, I'm not missing something.
Yep.
You're also trying to figure out still because what you've described as a boundary seems to be a good fairness aspect. But the problem you also seem to have is that when you look at the commercial, is if they seem to be needing a higher rate or something, then you've got to be careful there also, is because they do use a lot more energy. But you can't, trying to figure out what's a fair cost. So is that part of that's not part of the cost of service, is that part of the rate design that you're looking
Well,
at that?
it's a combination. It's really part of the rate design, because the cost of service tells us, okay, like in this example, the general secondary service, that'd be a commercial, says that they would need an 11% increase, which means that in the rate design, we may want to give them a 3%, in my example. So it is somewhat related. You bring up a good point, because I'm talking about a national problem that was identified, everybody always knew it, but really came to a head about 20 years ago. When states of course regulate investor-owned utilities through the public service commissions. And when a utility would do a rate filing, the residential ratepayers in that state were represented by the Attorney General's office. The large industrials traditionally hired people like me to help intervene on their behalf. And who was always left unprotected were the commercial classes. So what happened over the course of years is the commercials kept getting a little bit more of an increase than the residentials or the industrials. So when Michigan, as an example, went to customer choice, where customers could choose their own power supplier, Detroit Edison lost 25% of their commercial load. Their most profitable load, because they had continuously given them more of an increase, and they were so far above cost of service that most of their recovery, most of their bottom line income was derived from the commercial class. So they lost 25% of it to the independent power producers. So the state of Michigan had to go through an entire, what they called it, de-skewing process to get these rates back in line with cost of service. So even though I say I don't ever want to get to cost of service, but we do want to go in the direction that cost of service is telling us, because we don't want the Detroit Edison situation occurring, where we're so unfair to one customer, and because things change, and they will in our industry, that all of a sudden we start losing them. And now all of a sudden that leaves the rest of your ratepayers exposed. So,
Well, the thing on that too is, you're probably saying the same thing, is that everybody has to remember that if you raise the commercial, the residents are just going to pay it anyway, because they're just going to pass it through. But at the same time, and I think you will get to it later in the slides when you're talking about whether you have a increase charge for more for an increased energy use or less. But that's where you want to have some of your conservation charges, because you're trying to make things as efficient as you can. And I think that's where some of the data collection could be a little problematic, because you're trying to figure out water and energy. Is a large company using a large amount, are they being efficient with it? So if they're wasting it, then it's not fair for them to pay a lower rate to it. So because you'd want to try to make them go to use less power and to pay a reasonable amount, instead of saying, okay, you're going to stay at that high power rate, you're going to cause us to keep a higher rate of energy. But so we're not doing it. So there's that, you've got to find that right conservation place where you can convince them and not get it passed along.
and a lot of utilities are moving to incentivize energy conservation through time differentiated rates. And the reason for that is most utilities tend to peak at 7 o'clock in the evening. And that's usually the highest cost time for power supply. Now, when you send that type of a price signal, it gives the incentive for customers to purchase more energy efficient appliances. Also, the other thing from a utilities perspective that doesn't have AMI is that energy efficiency programs, like rebate programs and those types of things, tend to be cost effective. In other words, it sounds weird when we give rebates to use less of our service, reducing their kilowatt hour sales. But what happens is because most of the reduction for residential occurs during at 7 o'clock in the evening when the residential class peaks, they reduce their capacity needs or demand piece by a greater percentage than they reduce their kilowatt hour needs consumption. So what happens is it actually frees up additional revenue sources in a sense for the utility. They don't have to buy as much market energy, for example, or they don't have to add more transformer capacity. So energy efficiency programs tend to be actually profitable for utilities. I know that sounds strange. That's why utilities offer rebate programs. Do you have those here?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, I think in this, probably here, one of the biggest things is air conditioning. But if you're trying to incentivize somebody to pay $10,000 to $20,000 for a new air conditioner for a small rebate, it's hard because they've got such a big output. So it's something I guess we should look at more, but it's hard to push that rebate program to the residents.
Yeah, I don't want to project other things we've done other places here because your power supply cost structure is quite a bit different. It's very lower cost than is other places, but usually when you get to the pricing that you're like 20, 30,000 like that, that'd be more of a commercial installation. And so the rebates for them can be pretty substantial. I mean, because it's usually on a tonnage basis. And the more efficient above SEER that they put it in, the bigger the rebate. So the rebates can get pretty big. For one we set up, I just went off the top of my head, I know one utility, I think a rebate was $3,000 for like a $20,000 air conditioner.
Well,
So-
the cost of service, I guess, so the data, because that's the key issue there, is who is using a big chunk of the power. And so again, can you make those efficient?
Correct.
Or are they using the amount that they need? Same
Yeah.
thing with water. So that's the key issue, I think. So to me, gathering that proper data is a big issue to say, okay, we see this aspect, does the customer see it?
Yeah.
And so we share the data among the governing group, like I said, and among the customers to try to figure out the best way to do it.
You know, right now, over the past 20 years, in a sense, you know, we've been trying to deal with things like energy efficiency by doing rebate programs. If you want to call those Band-Aids, in a sense, you can. But the reason is because we're not sending the proper price signal to let customers make their own decisions. And when you send those price signals through time differentiated rates, it's most likely, depending on when you peak, but my gut tells me they're already gonna have the financial incentive to implement energy efficiency without having to offer the rebates. Does that make more sense? Because we're sending the price signal that if you use it at 7 o'clock, it's gonna cost you 15 cents a kilowatt hour. If you use it at 2 o'clock in the morning, we're only gonna charge you 5 cents. Now they have more incentive to implement those energy efficiency programs to reduce their consumption at 7 o'clock at night. All right.
Do you utilize any of that information when you do your rate studies? Any type of rebate programs, or do you suggest the city incorporating a type of rebate program that they don't have? For instance, the peak demand I guess what stops us from doing peak demand is we don't have the metering to do it, where we would say, okay, we're gonna charge you this much at this time frame. If you cut a bunch out during that time frame, then you're gonna pay cheaper, you know, I'm sure you're familiar with that, but.
Yeah. In our base studies, traditionally, unless it's specifically requested in a proposal, the rebate program analysis is not included in a traditional study. However, usually when you do the studies, you start understanding where they can save money by reducing and how that can be done. And so insight can be given on the rebate programs, but to actually develop the rebate programs or the amount of the rebates is a special analysis.
Am I true on that, Joe? That's why we don't do that, is because the metering just can't do it?
We currently can't gather that data. But we are moving in that direction.
But we have the data for commercial, just to make sure it's totally clear, right? We have the commercial data, we don't have a residential data. Commercial, we have most of the information for demand, we're charging them demand.
For certain customers that meet that threshold for demand, we've got
Correct.
that, but across our entire load, we don't have the AMI to see, what that demand is. But like Mark mentioned, there's different ways, like the SCADA feeder data and stuff like that can get us there.
But currently, we don't charge, we don't have a program where we charge more, how should I put it?
Time of use.
Time-based charging. We have no peak demand, we have nothing.
We have a
We have the data, but we don't base it on rates.
So we have a time of use rate for large customers.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah. So, and I want to say that there's maybe 5, maybe 6 customers that are total that meet that. But we do not have a time of use residential rate or a commercial rate that's like what we're talking about.
It's 2:00. Do you want to take a 5-minute break? And we'll come back and about halfway
Yes.
through.
Okay.
Yeah.
How are you? Good, how are you? Need a water? Yeah. You should make this guy by the refrigerator. All right, thank you. Well, welcome back. What I'm going to talk about next is different types of rate structures, starting with the residential. This is an example of your current residential rate. You have a monthly service charge of $12.50. Most likely that rate should probably be higher. I mean, it's hard to tell without a cost of service study. My gut tells me most of the studies that we do, it ends up between $20 and $25. You seem to be a lower cost area, so it might be like 18 or so, but in other words, that number should go up, which if that number goes up, that means that some of the other numbers should go down. So then you get into the tiered rates. Now, you can see that the first 1,000 kilowatt hours is about 9 cents, and then the next 1,000's almost the same, 9.2. It really doesn't hit you till you get over 2,000. Then it's a little over 12 cents, and then over 4,000, a little over 14. And there is cost justification for an inclining block rate structure once you get your customer charge to the appropriate levels. And I'll go into what that customer charge recovers in an upcoming slide. But once that's there, what occurs then is at the first 1,000, because that tends to be used more consistently throughout the year. In other words, that's more of a regular domestic usage. It's a consistent usage pattern, and so the cost to serve that first 1,000 is most likely less costly. Because if you think about the cost, it's easier to explain when I discuss it in water. The concepts are the same. Let's say in water it costs $12 per 1,000 gallons for each unit of capacity, all right, in the water treatment and transmission system. So let's say you have a user that uses 1,000 gallons of water every single month. Their capacity costs are $12. Their billing units is 12. So 12 divided by 12 is $1, right? Now you have somebody that sprinkles their lawn, all right? They use the next 1,000 gallons during the summer season, say for 4 months. The cost of the capacity is still the same, $12. But they only use it for 4 months. So 12 divided by 4 is $3. So you can see why the usage pattern, like in the case of irrigation, is more costly than domestic use for water. The similar thing occurs in electric. That baseline usage is less costly to serve because it's used more consistently. And once you get up the tiers, the frequency of the use is lower and lower and lower, justifying a blocked rate. There are issues with blocked rates in that if you incentivize too strongly, if you shift too much fixed cost recovery into those outer two blocks, when customers respond to it through energy efficiency programs, then they're reducing their usage in the blocks where all your fixed cost recovery is. So you have to be careful in how that's balanced. Does that make sense? If you have too strong a price signal, it can harm you financially.
But you can model that relatively easy, right? Because you can
Yeah.
sort of, that's what you'd want to estimate. You'd want to
Correct.
figure out, okay, once I do that, we know that people are going to, especially we get a higher rate. So that one tier, we're going to lose customers at that tier. And we're actually hoping to lose a little bit because we're doing it for conservation.
Yep.
So that's what you've got to figure out is what tiers you are collecting your most money from and what we're gonna do and what's a fair rate.
Yep.
The other thing too, I think right now for Boulder City, we're gonna have to look at our resolutions because that's part of the problem, I think, with the monthly service charge for power and energy. It's power and water is the service charge definition. So it has been modified, but it's still not clear on what we're really trying to collect from that service charge. So that's one thing we definitely, and if we do modify it, we should change the resolution to try to make it clear what we're doing, especially if we're gonna go from 12.5 to 20.
Or whatever it
The
is.
definition isn't gonna be clear enough to say, why did we do that?
Yeah.
And then again, like I said, if you can you lower the rate enough to make the bill not go outrageous, because you're paying that every month, and so you know you're gonna have a guaranteed amount during the year
Yeah.
compared to, because you can't do anything to make that service charge
Correct.
go away.
Yeah. California back, if you go back 6, 7 years ago, PG&E, for example, they had a 5-tier inverted block rate structure with the first block priced at like 12 cents and the outer block at like 36 cents. I know that's hard for you looking at the rates that you have, but with solar, because were basically shifted all the fixed cost recovery into these outer blocks. And when solar was implemented, that's where they were reducing their usage from. So PG&E had to increase rates substantially just to overcome that loss of fixed cost recovery. And the state of California required the investor-owned utilities to combine these blocks together. And not all together, they still have an inverted block, but to bring the 5 down to 3, to try to lessen that impact. So it's just something to be aware of. Now, one of the things that you talked about was the customer charge, and it goes by different names: facilities charge, customer charge, readiness to serve charge. But it's probably the least understood charge that utilities have. Electric, water, wastewater, gas, it doesn't matter. It's just not understood very well. Customers tend to want to think of it as like a Dunkin' Donuts, where they think that, okay, Dunkin' Donuts doesn't charge you to walk through the door. Why does an electric utility have to charge me a fixed amount for usage every month? Well, Dunkin' Donuts makes an investment on behalf of the community, but utilities make an investment specifically for every customer. In other words, we have to install a meter. We have to repair the meter. We have to replace the meter. We have to read the meter every month. We have to send the customer a bill. And we have to maintain that service drop from the wires to their home. Those are all fixed costs that do not vary based on consumption. And then on top of that, and this is where there's always things that are direct and things that are indirect. I told you the direct ones that go into that. But that home needs to have a wire that extends from the substation to their facility. Without that wire, we can't deliver electricity. Now, the question then becomes how much of that wire should go into the customer charge and how much should go into the usage charge. And what we do is something called a minimum system analysis. In other words, we look at what the minimum sizing requirements are for the system, and we apportion the system cost based upon that minimum sizing to identify what that fixed charge should be. Okay? So the first part is direct. The second part is a little bit of art in there, art and science, both. But the reason it's important to charge the appropriate fixed charge, I'm from Michigan, and I think Michigan's the best state to live in for 3 months of the year. And a lot of other people must think the same way as me, because probably about 16, 17% of our population goes somewhere else in the winter, all right? Well, if we don't charge them the appropriate customer charge while they're gone, then they're getting subsidized by the year-round ratepayers in Michigan, the ones that have to endure the Michigan winters. They're the ones who are subsidizing the seasonal customers. So it becomes a fairness issue in establishing that rate. But let me say hypothetically that, okay, you're currently at $12.50. Let's say that the numbers come out and make them up at $25. There's no way I would recommend you to move that rate from $12.50 to $25 in 1 year.
Will you speak more into the microphone, please? We can't hear you. Thank you.
Sure. I would want you to take
You lost the
steps.
microphone. You lost it, I think.
I would want you to, scared me. I would want you to take steps, slowly incremental steps over time, to move that $12.50 to $25. I won't want you to do it all at once. That's another piece of input from the governing body. How much will you allow me to increase that customer charge? And of course, by doing that, it's going to decrease the energy rate, or decrease the increase in the energy rate. do you want me, are you willing to go $2 or $3? I probably wouldn't recommend much more than $3. And yeah, over 5 years, we'll get there, you know? Might take 5 years, that's okay.
Right, well, and just for the committee, you know, because I guess we need to be careful how we explain how a rate process, or somebody would, a consultant might do the rate process. But just remember, in this 9, what happens, what the city just did in this last rate, through the rate study process, was that they now have a energy rate and a delivery rate. So part of that wire charge, I believe, is in that delivery rate. Now, your explanation for the partial use of the state, or that's a great example. And I'm not sure if Boulder City has as much of that as some of the other things, but that's the education that I think I want the committee and us to be able to expect, and the city, is to understand what aspects of Boulder City, and how do we modify it? Do we need to modify the rates and the rate structure? And I think that's the key issue. We need to look at the rate structures.
Yes.
To see what might need to be done. So in this one right now, the 9 is you've got the energy charge and the delivery charge. So now what I'm hearing you saying is that's how you would reduce it. You would take some of the delivery charge and put it into the service charge.
Yep.
So those are things but you need to make sure you tell the public and everybody what's going on.
Yes, yeah.
Can you go back a slide to our rates?
That is that one.
Oh, yeah. To me, that's pretty easy to understand. The way the city bills us is not easy to understand. Why doesn't the city have their structure like that on the billing? The way they do it, because I have a bill in front of me, is they charge 6 cents a kilowatt hour for your entire usage, and then they say, well, 1,000 of that is at 2.5 cents, and 1,000 of that is at 2.8 cents, and then a certain amount over, I guess it would be the 1,000, and then if you're 900, if in my case 2,900 kilowatts, that 930 kilowatts is 5 cents an hour. It's just confusing as hell to me.
Yeah, I've never seen that. Is that, just out of curiosity, are you postcard billing or is it sheets?
I have one in front of me.
It is, it's okay, yeah, it's kind of.
I don't know, Joe, why don't we, I mean, to me, that's very clear, and this has always confused me, and I'm sure it confuses a lot of people.
Well, you're just
you know.
you're just showing the premiums you're paying. Yeah, somebody must have thought that was the right way to do it years ago.
We could look at that.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, you must have taken our billing and converted it to,
No, this is on your website.
this is in the website?
No, it's a website, but it's not in the resolution. The resolution has broken out differently.
Oh, your resolution's like that, but your website's
Yes.
like that.
So if that's the case, then it is confusing. So
Okay.
the resolution, so that's another reason we have to really look hard at that resolution. Because that's what I just was saying was, we just changed it in this rate, we just changed the energy rate and the delivery rate. So your energy rate is that first aspect of the 6 cents, and then the delivery rate is based on how much you use
Oh,
in
okay, I
each
see what
tier.
you mean, yeah.
And so actually, it's confusing, but it's helpful, because it tells you how you could redo it and be more efficient. If you could use less energy, you can get rid of one of that tier, and you understand what the utility is. So it can be, for an analytical person like me, it's helpful. And I'm not saying you're not, don't get me wrong. But for me, it's helpful, and I think that's part of the problem. You've got some of the citizens that probably say, okay, I understand what they're charging me, and other ones are going, what the heck is going on here? There's too much data.
I mean, you might have a 5% of the population understands how utilities are billed, and the other 95% doesn't know anything other than, you know, I can understand I'm paying for 3,000 kilowatts. I can understand that I'm paying the first 1,000, I'm paying this much, the second 1,000. But when you split it up into delivery and, man, it's just, to me, it's much more confusing to the average citizen.
But you need more than just this, though, also, because you need to understand that we're doing an energy and a delivery charge.
But you could put a note in there about delivery charge, and then you can just, or you could list it both ways. That would probably be the way to do it.
Yeah.
It would be much less confusing.
Yeah, the problem I'm understanding is we're limited to on space with that, so that was part of the reason it was done.
Yeah.
Because they didn't want to go to the backside. So I think, but we definitely, these are things that, in the overall rate process, that we have not done, and that's why I get a little hyper, is trying to figure out how can we understand it and make what's advantageous for the citizens. So, sorry.
Yeah, that's right. I think to me, just me, because maybe it's because I'm used to seeing bills look like this seems more transparent to me.
To me
Yeah.
too.
One of the things that, when it comes to increasing the customer charges, usually the biggest backlash or concern over getting it to the appropriate levels is what is the impact on low income? All right? And the issue with low income is some low income customers are in fact low use customers. Some low income customers use more than the average. It may be because they purchased a home that was built in the 40s and 50s and not properly insulated. They don't have energy efficient appliances or air conditioners, or the windows may not be properly sealed. So you have some low income that use a lot more than a traditional residential and others that use less. So there isn't this clean impact on how a customer charge necessarily affects low income. And what I request utilities, and this seems to be a big trend going on throughout the U.S., is rather than trying to help or think you're helping low income through rates, do it through programs. In other words, have a low income assistance program where a customer comes in with verification that they're at a certain level and you put them on a discounted rate. That's the best way to help low income. It's not through the rate structures. Because if you try to do it through rate structures, it's going to be hit and miss. All right.
How do we do it?
I'm not sure.
We have a program.
From what I remember, the program is if you have a certain income level, then you get a certain discount percentage-wise.
That's my understanding, yes.
Oh, so it has nothing to do with energy saving rebates or?
Correct.
Oh, okay.
So this is a graph I created a few years ago. It's from a utility in Massachusetts. And if you look at the red line represents the average residential usage every in a month. Okay, I know you guys are up in the thousands, but in Massachusetts it's around 550 is the average residential usage in a month. And the blue line represents the low-income customers' usage. Each individual, we had about 410 individual low-income customers that were identified. And you can see that about 2/3 of them actually do use less than the average residential. But 1/3 of them use substantially more than the average residential. And what this is, the reason I put this in there is to show that if you try to do it through rates, it's going to be hit and miss. In other words, if your justification is keeping the customer charge lower to benefit low income, you will for some, but harm others in the same way.
One of the things that I had discussed in other meetings was that your first tier, look at the first tier to get that as close as cost as you can get. And then go from there. So that way, if a lower income, you can incentivize them to say, okay, if you are using what you need, then you're doing the best we can. If you want to if you're not efficiently doing it, now if your house needs to be doing something, that's something else, and that's where you definitely could look at the rebate. But if somebody decides they want to have their air conditioning set at 72 instead of 78, that's their problem. It's not the other residential problem to offset them. But that's where I think an at cost at a reasonable tier is a way to look at it, at least look at it. So that's where I would disagree a little bit, but it's not necessary, and I'm not trying to make a rate for the lower income. I'm just saying that, in my opinion, that should help them, because you're just encouraging them, educating on how they can get to that level.
Correct. You know, again, that's, as a consultant, when I go before governing bodies, one of the things I often say to them is, my role is not to tell you what to do. My role is to help guide you and tell you the positives and the negatives of any decision you're making. That's my role, and that's kind of what, part of the reason I do that is I used to take it personally when a governing body didn't take my recommendations 10 years ago. It's made my life so much easier. After I've said, I don't care. My role is this, it's not to get that through anymore. So anyway, but what you're bringing up, Mr. Carr, is great. That is exactly the input that we would be looking for when we bring back to get that guidance from you. And once I have the data broken out, I'll be able to more intelligently answer your question on that low tier and the cost. Okay. Now, there's a lot of trends going on across the U.S. Our industry is changing, and our rates are changing with it. I mentioned several times time of use rates. What I haven't mentioned is something called residential demand charges. Back in 2014, this utility in Nebraska, it was a public power district, called me up and they wanted to implement a residential demand charge. I tried to talk them out of it. They put it in place, and the number, the cost-based number said that the residential demand charge for cover distribution should be about $2. And so we started at 50 cents per kW demand. An average residential has a peak of about 7 kW. I'm sure it's more than that here, but that 50 cents meant that the biggest increase, or the average increase from that demand charge, would be $3.50. And of course, I'm lowering the energy to offset it. And so to try to make sure there was just minimal impact, so we implemented it. And I thought, man, they're going to get a lot of backlash from this. So I kept in touch with the general manager, asked him, how's it going? How many complaints you get? And every time he said, Mark, we didn't get any complaints. After a while, he got sick of me calling. But basically, we did that for 4 years, and we got it up to the $2. Nobody ever complained, and we subsequently did that for probably 10, 12 other utilities. But it's becoming very common practice to have residential demand charges. Part of the reason is because of solar. Without getting too technical, what happens with solar when they put a solar installation, solar is good. I mean, it's good for the environment, but if we don't charge it properly, we may create a subsidy other ratepayers have to pay. And what happens with solar is the average residential customer peaks at 7, 8 o'clock in the evening, all right? When you have a solar on your roof, you're giving the energy back in the afternoon. When 7, 8 o'clock comes along, solar might be producing, but it's not producing like it was at 2 in the afternoon. So what happens is it doesn't reduce their impacts that they're creating on the distribution system. So the demand charge picks that up and charges them appropriately for the use of the distribution system. And that's primarily the reason why a lot of utilities are moving toward residential demand charges. All right, but that does require more advanced metering.
Can you explain the demand charge again? I'm a little confused.
Oh,
about
no, I should have. Yeah.
I mean, it
I'm
sounds to
always
me like
full of
it's just
stories.
it's just a charge, like your usage charge, or your, I guess, what did you call it? Your 1250, your usage charge.
That's a customer
Everybody,
charge.
everybody pays the same on a demand charge, right?
No,
Oh, so it's based on what?
what their peak usage is in the course of a month. So to give you an example,
Peak usage. You mean when
Peak.
you use the most energy the time of day?
well, let's say it's
A moment in time.
moment in time. Yep. So the meter records two things. It records the kilowatt hours that they're using. It also records the KW, which represents the peak draw that they had during the month.
So it's 7 PM.
It might be 7
It might be
p.m.
7 PM and it's, whatever.
Yeah, on
that-
Wednesday or whatever.
and so you base the charge on how high that is?
Correct,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, the
And that-
one way to do it, just to make sure, so you're talking watts and energy. So are you familiar with watts and energy?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Just
No, actually, I apologize. You know, I worked for utility for 17 years, and I had customer service, meter reading, and billing under me. And one thing, whenever a large customer called with a question on their demands, my customer service reps couldn't answer it. It would go to the supervisor, he couldn't answer it, so it always ended up at my desk. So what I came to realize is that about 75% of the people that even work for utilities don't understand demand. And I had to go through an education process for staff that worked for me. But that's why I was always concerned about putting in place for residentials. But it's becoming very common. I have not been pushing it, believe me. Time of use is a lot easier to implement, a lot more understandable for customers than demand.
Well, the one thing too, I thought it was brought up at one of our meetings that we can't discriminate against solar, and we don't want to. But if you were to say that a demand charge would be charged to a solar customer and not another customer, would that be discriminatory?
That would be discriminatory. You'd have to charge it for all your
Because
residentials.
theoretically, it's
Yeah.
easily justified, just as you stated it was. And to me,
Correct.
that wouldn't be, the reason I asked the question, because I don't think it would be discriminatory, because you can justify it, that there's a purpose for charge them that and not somebody else
Yeah.
that. But again, you could also do it as the levels too, but then that gets confusing for
Yeah.
residential.
So how do you figure that out? So you pick a time of day and you look at the demand of that time, and do you look at that every day and then average it out for 30 days? Or how, or it's
No,
just if it's so high, then it's so much money?
Yeah, think about, I'll simplify it. Let's assume it's 60-minute integrated demand. Okay, so there are about 740, what month are we in? We're in the month of May. So 744 hours in the month of May. All right, now, the peak demand says, of those 744 hours, what was the peak draw during the month of May? That's what that's measuring. So it's going to vary by customer, but for this, say for customers at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday in the middle of the month, that was their peak draw, and let's say it's 10 kW, that's what the demand would be based upon,
So it's basically the highest
highest.
highest rate, I mean, the highest usage you had
Correct,
for that month. And
Yeah.
every month they charge that?
every month, yeah.
And it's real low, obviously, for us, it would be real low in the wintertime.
Probably.
But, and what do the charges vary from what to what? Like, for instance, if we did it, I mean, can you give me an idea of what that rate would be for, in the wintertime it'd be $1, in the summertime it'd be $3, something like that?
I
Or
usually wouldn't, the distribution, I'm gonna dig a little deeper, okay, to answer this question. I want you to think of the demand component or capacity component of electricity consists of basically 5 components really. One is generation capacity. You need to have the generators producing the power someplace, and you have to have the capacity entitlement for your system. So that's the first capacity. The second piece, that goes in demand. The second one is transmission. You're charged from your local transmission provider for your peak demand that you're creating on the transmission system. Then from that point, it comes into your system, into the sub-transmission facilities, the higher voltage lines of Boulder. And there's another component of capacity related to that. Then it goes to the area substations, another component of the capacity for that, and then the local distribution wires. Now, the reason I stated all that's what goes into a traditional demand charge. For maybe like an industrial customer, maybe $15. But that's not really what I'm after recovering from residential. What I'm trying to recover are the costs from that local substation and the wires and transformer. All right, so it's the demand-related components for that section of the system. So it's not the entire, all the capacity, it's just the local distribution, which traditionally, I would guess would come out to be $1.50, $2 here per kW would be the cost-based rate. And so in the winter months, I'm assuming you're probably less than, average residential is less than 10. Throughout the US, the residentials typically peak around 7 kW, but you're definitely higher use here. So I'm guessing in the winter it's about 10 kW draw and probably 15 or 20 in the summer. So, and that would be based on that peak. And so I would be if we were to step it, I'd want to step that in, obviously. But that's down the road. I wouldn't even consider that right now, because time of use is, you need to have the same metering as time of use, and time of use is a lot easier to implement.
And the other thing, to go down the rabbit hole a little bit further, is that a lot of the costs that you're stating, Boulder City luckily doesn't have.
Yep.
Now, that it's confusing, but these are things that when you look at a rate aspect, you have to, because since Boulder City, we don't have a lot of it, but Boulder City has capacity in Hoover. So we have a little bit of capacity that we don't have to get a separate contract for, so we don't have to pay extra. We get a lot of power out of Meade substation, and there's no transmission there. We have to pay transmission for the Crisp hydro, but we don't pay it. So we have a lot of costs that's the reason why our costs should be so much lower, because we don't pay what even an average municipality pays. And so we just need to make sure that the governing bodies, so I like the way you put it, understands these facts, because if another consultant comes in and throws the average of the United States into it, it doesn't help Boulder City.
Yeah.
And the residents could end up paying more, because this is what the nation does. And Boulder City doesn't have that. That's why I harp so much on that type of stuff.
And that's why I'm always hesitant to give too many ranges, because your structure is so much different than typical. You're very low cost. I mean, your ratepayers are very fortunate. Your city fathers made great decisions, and they're benefiting from it today. I think we just want to keep it going, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I personally, I don't see anything wrong with the demand cost. I mean, you got people that might weld, for instance, and they're, drawing some heavy power, and why shouldn't they pay a little bit more a month for that? But, I mean, that's just my opinion, but,
Well, it's a weakness in our rate structures, and the weaknesses are derived from history, and because we never had the ability to bill it accurately. Now we do with AMI. I'm going to talk about solar and net metering. I think that might be a little controversial, but I want to get into that in more detail. Before I do, I want to talk briefly about general service. Your general service, this is your rates, service charge, monthly charge, $17. Then your rates is the first 3,000s, 11 cents. Above that is 12.5. And you can see they have a demand charge of $3.43. Now, when you get into this commercial, you have customers that vary in their usage. You may have a small shop that uses 500 kilowatt hours a month. And in this same rate class, you may have a large user that uses 10,000 kilowatt hours a month. So you have this wide range of customers. So this is a situation where I'd probably discourage an inclining block rate. I would focus more on that demand. You have the demand charge, and that's a good thing. Yeah, 343. But it's actually, if I were to restructure this rate, it'd be reversed. Because if you look at the demand, it's the demand charge for the amount over 10 kW. So if they hit 11 kW, they'll be charged $3.43. So they're not paying, so that would imply to me that the first 3,000, energy-wise, should be higher than the second block.
How much data do we need to model that and to go over that?
It would be just the billing data would give us the data we need.
Because, yeah, I agree, because that's what, but it's still, there is a customer, I guess what I would see is that if you could do just to discuss it, where you do 4 categories, where if you said you had a lower one that was using, again, how do we do fairness? If they're, and I think it's more in the water than you do in here,
Yeah.
but electrical, but it's still, it's like, okay, if you do have a small shop, how do we make that fair? And if we have a large shop, how do we make it fair, but not, so we don't want to overcharge them, so we don't want them to pass it on to the customers, but we want to make sure everybody's running efficiently.
Yep.
And so that's where I think it's just to be able to discuss it. I'm not saying that either way is right or wrong, but we definitely need to discuss it, and we need to know the data so we can show.
Correct.
And then model it. Say, okay, if you did it this way, this is what you're going to collect. If you do it this way, this is what you're going to collect. This is how it's going to affect.
Yeah,
And so that's what I think would be very helpful in a rate study.
yeah. And yeah, actually, in some ways, I do like the rate structure if you reversed and flipped those two numbers around on the energy. It'd actually be an ideal rate structure.
Mark, can you go a little bit just into declining rate structure and like how that works, why you do it, like
In
just
this situation.
in this situation? Yes.
The reason is, if you look at the first 10, KW demand is not charged. They're not billed anything for it. So, in order to recover their impact on the distribution system, it has to be like residential through the energy component. So the energy component would be the first 3,000 kilowatt hours. Now, once you get over 10 kW, most likely you're using more than 3,000 kilowatt hours. In the second block, now you're getting hit with demand at 343, and you're getting hit with a higher energy rate. So basically, you're getting, I don't want to say double charge, that's be extreme, but you're getting overcharged once you get over 10 kW and undercharged for the first 10 kW. Because they're not covering the distribution impacts in that first 3,000 kilowatt hours. But you can see that once you get over the 3,000, you're paying a higher rate and you're getting hit by the demand charge of 343 because your demand of KW is exceeding 10. Is that making more sense?
Wouldn't that make also that the monthly service charge on these commercial customers should be increased? Because that would also translate into the smaller commercial
Correct.
customers paying a fairer share.
Correct, that too. Well, there's two things with your customer charge. I didn't get into this, but when it comes to commercial, you have two types of service levels. You have single-phase service, which is the smaller commercials, probably most of them. And then you have three-phase service, which is some of them. And three-phase service is a lot more expensive to install. The metering's more costly. You have to have CTs and PTs installed. Usually you'll have a single-phase customer charge and a three-phase customer charge. The rates after that are all the same. It's just the customer charge that differs.
But again, this is where you need more time to understand it and discuss it. Because you've got, Boulder City again is different than a lot of cases. You've got, we have low growth, so that we aren't growing there. But we have our hydropower, which is in certain times of the year, we still keep that as our base. Now, once we go above that hydro, then we get into, and right now, hopefully, that's being looked into, I believe. But right now, you're being, anything at a higher energy rate is being charged the market rate. That's the most expensive in most cases. Once in a while, you get lucky and the market rate's lower, but most of the time when we need the market rate, we're going to be charged the higher rate. That's what he's been explaining. So when you get into the commercial, that's where we definitely have to look at it, because they could be causing us to go to the market rate. So then they're the ones charging costing the city to pay more for the energy. Where a lot of times, like with Nevada Power, they've got 10-year plans or 20-year plans, so they've averaged out their energy, and when they go above a certain rate, they're paying an average rate, where the market rate is can be a lot more expensive. When the market's low, you're great. When the market's high, you're screwed. Sorry. So these are things where, again, Boulder City is different enough where you really have to look at it to what does sort of look a little odd. You really have to discuss it. You got to look at the resolution. You got to look at the commercial rate. You got to look at how the people are using it to really, in my opinion, to get a fairness of a way to do it. So that's why understanding this is very helpful, and that's why we want to be able to discuss it also as much as we can.
Well, it was also my understanding that demand is a cost on the city of Boulder City, because that essentially means we would need to supply that at any given time. So it's not just an income to the city, but it's a cost.
Correct. Yep. And sometime in the future, I'd like to talk even more about what you're saying. It's called standby charges in a way.
Yes.
And that is another thing that the industry is moving towards, standby charges for customers who want more reliable service and want another line built. And so now you got a service line built, and there's no way to recover that without a standby charge.
Yeah. Again, though, there's a lot of things. So we're down the rabbit hole just to say how different Boulder City is, and we only have a small piece, and I'm not sure how well we can do it. But Hoover is a major asset to Boulder City.
We're only getting half its
Look,
capacity.
and I know that, but you still have, in our contract, we have the capacity that we don't have to pay an extra contract. We would probably, because we pay more, we still have to get an extra contract, but it's not the average municipality has to pay 100% for that extra capacity that you two are talking about. Boulder City does not. If we want to get the full security, we would have to do another contract. But we already have some, and that's where Hoover has it. Go down the rabbit hole more, spinning reserves. So you can spin the units and have that available for capacity. And then if you need it, you can do it. And so Boulder Cities, with its contract, has that availability to it. It's low. It is very low because with the water and everything like that. But we have it where hardly any other utility has that. And it's just a consideration that the governing body needs to understand how we might want to adjust the rates. Because we've been doing things historically, and it worked. Now we're into a point we might need to rate, and we need to look at our rate structure. We need to really review the rate structure. I totally agree. But what is the fair way to do it? And we got to be very careful to not say, well, here's the national way to do it.
Yeah. Some of the trends in the commercial around the U.S. that we're seeing is electric vehicles. I didn't really talk much about residential EVs, but the other part of it is commercial EV charging stations, DC fast chargers like Tesla's charging stations. Each one of those charging stations oftentimes are built to draw as much as 300 or more kW. And there may be 8 charging stations located. And so that's a potential demand of 2,400 kW or 2.4 megawatts of potential demand that charging station can create. So what utilities are trying to do, you don't have a rate structure currently that would fit that well. Because when you do a cost of service study, the cost of service study tells you the ideal rate at the average usage pattern in a class. So let's say, for example, it's your commercial demand class. And the average load factor, load factor is nothing more than a ratio between their peak demand, I talked about earlier, and their average demand in the year, or in the month. Say the average load factor is 50%. So the ideal rates tell us at what the ideal rates would be at a 50% load factor. These charging stations come in at a 10% load factor. so it doesn't fit the profile. So if you put them on that rate, you actually overcharge them. You will overcharge them. I know that sounds strange, but you will overcharge them. So, but my biggest concern is not necessarily that part of it, although it needs to be fixed on the rate per side. It's the extension cost. That can be substantial. Who's going to pay for this extension cost? Should it be Boulder City Utility, or should it be the customer? If it's the customer, should you pay a portion of it? So those are the other considerations, because those investments can be substantial.
So, I mean, you bring up a good point about, I mean, let's say I don't know a lot about electric cars, I don't have one, but let's say I got an electric car, and I get home at 6 in the evening on a summer day, and I plug it in,
Yeah.
I'm sucking some power, man. And I don't have to pay any extra for that,
Correct.
right? The way we have our structured.
Because you don't have time of use.
And every year we get more and more electric cars, right? And the customer really can be proactive, and they can plan their charging.
Easy enough, yeah.
But they don't have to because they have no incentive.
They don't even understand that our costs
And they
change.
might not have, again.
They don't know our costs are more expensive at 7 in the evening and 2 in the morning.
Well, I
They
mean,
don't
I
really
think most
understand or think
customers,
about it.
most utility customers know that. I know it comes in our little thing every month.
okay.
They usually go over that a couple times a year. Oh, peak demand, don't run your pool, don't do this.
Yeah.
I've never seen anything about don't charge your cars,
Yeah.
but, I mean, I would see, to me, there should be some kind of demand charge because of cars. I never thought about it until you mentioned it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's.
Well, a level 2 charging station at a home level, because the amperages and stuff, it's usually on average is about 7 kW demand or draw when they plug that car in with a level 2 charger. So yeah,
Again,
they're drawing 7 kW.
You're talking, I don't know anything about them, so I know if you plug 110 in, it's real slow.
Well, 110 is, yeah.
That's nothing.
No,
I know if they get the
level
superchargers,
two.
right? And if
Those
they
are
come,
DC,
they
but-
pull into their garage and they suck 70% of their power and they plug that supercharger in there, it takes 30 minutes to charge that battery up?
Yeah, they wouldn't have that at the home, though.
Oh, you wouldn't have that at all?
No, you'd have what's called a level 2 charging station.
So that's
which
what you're
is
talking about, is a
220.
home charger?
Yeah, and that's usually draws about 7 kW demand, which is
A lot.
a lot.
And there's only two types of chargers that almost all the electric cars have for residential. It's level 2 and level 1. Level 1 is 120.
Level 1 is be
120, and
It'd
that's,
take
I'm assuming
99
that's drawing
years.
20 amps.
Yeah, at a level 1 charger would take years to charge your car.
Yeah. But the level 2 charges it, what percentage more?
6 to 8 hours it would take in a level 2 charger.
I mean, it charges
And
4 or
a-
5
and a
times
DC
faster than the level 1, or 10
Yes.
times faster? I don't know.
Yeah,
I was just curious.
Probably 4 or 5 times.
4 or 5
faster.
times,
But a
okay.
DC fast charger, you're right, 20 to 30 minutes to get it to 80%.
But homes don't have that. That's only
No,
out on the
no,
road.
those are expensive.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's about,
right into your
80 to 100,000
Yeah, I was
per
gonna say,
charger.
But that is a substantial amount, and that will really mess with our demand
Yeah,
at peak hours if all the charger car guys plug their electric cars in at 6 or 7 in the evening. And
well, I want you to think about this. Let's say, theoretically, look 10 years in the future, and let's say everybody's gotten rid of their gas vehicles. I wouldn't, because there's some things I like, but maybe I go EV for some, but I got my little hot rod car, I like that. But so anyway, everybody owns an electric vehicle, and everybody has 2 of them in the garage. Right now, when we build out residential infrastructure, and I'm not sure how you do it here, but most of the time you put in like a 50 kVA transformer and you connect 5 homes to it. So each home theoretically is allocated 10 kW. Now, all of a sudden, everybody has 2 cars in the garage. We have time of use rates, and we say, charge your vehicle at 11 o'clock at night. So everybody turns them on at 11 o'clock at night. And they're all 7 kW draws with 5 homes. You're 350 kW is going through that. Not 350, would it be? About 70 kW. is going through that 50 kVA transformer, starting to overheat it, shortening its life. And of course, so what's going to happen when plus when these things occur is we're going to have to rebuild portions of our distribution system. That's not going to be a major issue because you're just going to have to either put in larger transformers in the residential areas or restructure, but it is something that is probably going to happen at some point in the future. So,
Speaking to that, I get scolded by our electrical department. We sell and install solar, and our neutrals are smaller gauge wires than the line. And so, looking at given 5 homes typical on a transformer, it's really easy to overload the neutral.
because of the output going up. Yeah, the one of the things, you're probably gonna like what we say next, you gotta be careful with is that inverter, because if it's not the proper inverter, which, like in Guam, for example, we do work for them, and they have feeders where in the 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 80% of the electric that's being consumed is being produced by solar. On the surface, that sounds good, but then all of a sudden a cloud comes over. And the solar production stops. Well, electricity has to be produced in the moment that customers need it. So it takes a few milliseconds to get that energy back in those areas. So even though solar is good in high concentrations, you have to now all of a sudden start being concerned about the installation of batteries. And I got a slide coming up that'll kind of show you how the value proposition changes when you have solar and batteries. It's a substantial benefit that then accrues. So, but that is something you gotta be careful with, is without batteries, you don't want too high a concentration of solar in any area. I'm not an engineer, I'm an accountant, so I'm just kind of relaying what other engineers have told me.
I'm just curious, I mean, solar is obviously not as big in Boulder City than it is in other towns in the area here because of our rates are lower, but it's still, I would assume, somewhat popular. I don't know what percentage difference, we might have, I don't know, 50% less solar than Henderson does, for instance. I mean, I don't know if I'm way off there or not, but.
Yeah, I don't have that information.
But I wonder what percentage in Boulder City, or even in Henderson, of people that have solar have a battery pack. I mean, I would think it's not a lot here. I know back in California, those people that live out in the country, boy, they want that battery pack, and they're getting them now, and they want to be able, because they're cutting power all the time for these fires.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that electric cars and solar power have quite an impact on the rates and the cost of power in a city. Yet, I mean, it's a great thing if you have solar or if you have electric cars, but you don't really pay. Technically, you might not exactly pay your fair share of what it costs because of those electric cars and solar power.
But yeah, that's why solar will
I do
need to
wanna
be, we
show you-
discussed it in some of the older ones, but we need to discuss it again in probably either a workshop or something to understand. Because really, I think as what we've discussed in the past is as much, you don't want to discriminate, you don't want to hamper it, but really the city can only handle so much rooftop solar for the deal. It can't, because if all that solar goes down, you've got to supply it, just as it said. So it's a touchy topic, but probably if we're looking at really possibly restructuring the rate process in this next one and going on in the future, you need to discuss it. So that's what I keep on saying. There's a lot of data and a lot of discussion to get the proper rate structure and the proper rates, in my opinion.
Do you, I guess You study that kind of stuff if it's in the contract, right? But otherwise you don't. You might make a recommendation, but,
With solar?
well, solar and electric cars,
mean,
the
usually-
impact that they have on rate structure.
Usually we
I
don't
mean,
put it in the report, but we do discuss it with the governing body, yes.
obviously,
Yeah.
it's different in different locations.
Yeah.
I mean, the desert is an area that's probably a whole lot different than, the non-desert area but obviously that's something you don't even look at here, right?
Well,
I mean, creating a somewhat of a surcharge for something like that and the impact that it does have on the amount of income the city makes or doesn't make because of it.
for behind the meter, yeah. We actually do make recommendations in that area. Actually, I got it coming up here. Why don't I go there real quick?
Do they actually have surcharges for that kind of thing in utilities?
It's not surcharges, it's structuring the rates differently.
They just structure them differently so that,
Yeah.
I mean, like a peak demand kind of a thing?
No, what it is if you look at a solar customer with rooftop solar, you have a bidirectional meter on them. And the meter says that, okay, let's say the customer takes 1,000 kilowatt hours from the utility and then gives you back 600. Right now, you do what's called net metering. You take the 1,000 kilowatt hours that they took, you subtract the 600 kilowatt hours they gave back, and you bill them at 400 kilowatt hours. That's called net metering.
Mm-hmm.
And because that 1,000 kW draw includes the impacts on the distribution system, what's happening is the net metering is not appropriately recovering all the costs related to providing service, which was never a big deal. We knew that years ago when we put it, solar started, but it wasn't a big deal. But over time it's grown, so it's become a big deal in California and Guam, different places around the U.S. see upward pressure on rates because of it. And so we've had to restructure those rates. But customers have made a financial economic decision based on the price signals that the utility has sent. And is it really fair to them to say, we're going to change your rate now, change the structure of the rate? Because they made an economic decision to install that solar array based upon your price signal. So normally what most utilities do is they grandfather existing customers that are on that net metering in. So they stay on it for a period of, say, 10 years or whatever. But then any new customers go to one or two other methodologies. And the most common is something called net billing, or its other terminologies, inflow-outflow method. What that is, same scenario. The customer takes 1,000 kilowatt hours and gives back 600. The 1,000 kilowatt hours is charged to the customer at your normal rate schedules. The 600 kilowatt hours that they give back is credited to them at the value of solar rate. All right? And actually, under PURPA laws, you're required to do that. It is, and you're under PURPA when it comes to that specific area. I know that, you think, okay, we're small, we're not covered by PURPA. And for the most part, you're not, but there's this one rule that was passed in July of 21 that said this applies to all utilities. All right, it has to do with avoided cost of value for any energy given back to us. And that's one of them. So anyway, the net inflow-outflow or net billing credits them at the avoided cost of value.
Yeah, I understand that, and I know that's been in the news for
Yeah. Oh, okay.
years because of the original, you're not paying for distribution and all that stuff. But, you brought up the thing about the cloud coming over. I just find that interesting because how much does that affect? I mean, if all of a sudden the clouds build up and it's still hotter than hell and there's still air conditioners are going and the clouds come over and these people that don't have battery packs, their solar goes phew. I mean,
There's a lot involved, and not being an engineer, I can't explain it all, but the inverters that are installed are going to have an impact. the concentration of solar off that feeder is gonna have an impact.
I would think that areas that have a lot of solar power, that can really mess with
It
the
could.
utility, you know?
It could.
But in Boulder City, I don't think it is because we just don't have a lot of solar, but.
No, in Guam it was. We had some feeders that was causing issues for the whole system because it was creating brownouts, not just on that feeder, but on their whole system. They'd have brownouts. So since we're on solar, I want to talk about that a little bit. When people look at solar production, they look at this type of a curve, okay, as far as that solar is going to be producing in the middle of the day with a nice smooth curve, right? That's kind of how it's envisioned, but the reality of it looks more like that, where it's going up and down throughout the day. And one of the things I did put in here, because in our studies that we did in Guam, what we noticed is that once the feeder exceeded 30% concentration of solar at the time of the system peak, and the peak in the afternoon, I mean, then the feeder had problems when it exceeded 30% concentration. So just something to bear in mind. So this just describes your current net metering methodology, which is really just net metering. It's just written out in this form. And I described the net billing, and one of the things that, when you ask for a cost of service study, it's very easy for us to identify the value of solar. It's easy for us to develop the net billing. Not always so easy to get it approved through city council. So I just want to give you that heads up on that. All that stuff can be provided in a traditional study, but when it comes to the actual working through all those different steps, that can be time consuming, so.
Can I ask how Boulder City does it? I mean, are we on, we give a rebate for power back and but it's considerably less than a 9 or 10 cent average that we pay, correct?
So what we do, since we've unbundled the energy and delivery rates, the net metering customer gets credited the energy charge, which has been fixed. It hasn't gone down. It's at 6.24 cents per kilowatt hour.
So they get 6% back as a credit.
Yes.
And they pay about 10 cents on an average.
They'll pay whatever their metering tier shows.
Yeah, but I'm just looking at an average, it's about,
Yep.
I'm about 10 cents, but, so it's 6 cents, okay. And is the old system, I guess we don't have the old system like they do in Henderson where they made the deal where they pay the exact amount that they charge and they grandfather those people in when they changed this net metering thing.
So we
But we don't have that, right? Because we never, in the infancy days, we I don't know, how did we have solar power in the days when they were doing that? Because that's all Nevada Power, wasn't it?
No, I think the first few solar customers we had were commercial government, like the bureaus, and then the Park Service. We've always had net metering since
It
that
always
time.
had- That's what I thought.
Yeah, so we've always had net metering. The only change that we've made in the last 3 years is for new builds, they're limited in what they can build. So we do 100% payback, but they're limited to 80% of their actual or anticipated load
Okay.
on an annual basis.
I want to hit, you guys have been great with all these questions, I love it. But I want, some of this stuff, because of the questions I've already covered, so I want to kind of condense it for you. You actually have a time of use rate, obviously. If you look at this is your rate. You have, look at the two delivery charge. The delivery charge during the on-peak in 24, 10.7 cents.
What page is that? I'm sorry.
24.
24? Okay.
24 and above. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, this is where we need the eye test.
So the on-peak is 10.7, the off-peak is 5.7, and all of the periods 7.3. Then the demand charge is on-peak $15.19, off-peak $5.07, and then all other periods is $3.24. Then you have down below are just the combined cost, basically. So it's showing the combined cost all put together for your peak. So your on-peak rate in total is 16.9. I think what's up above is just showing how the bottom is created in this. So the on-peak charge is 16.9, the off-peak 11, about 12 cents. And all of the periods 13.5.
Could I ask a question about this chart? Joe, how many people do we have in town that are on a 2400 volt or larger scale?
I think we only have about 5 or 6 customers.
Right. So really, this is something, I've never paid attention to this because there's so few people that are, this is like pumping water, isn't it? Kind of customers. I mean, that's huge service.
I think we have some. I think the schools are on this based on how their distribution is set up.
Okay.
Some of the schools and some of the government maybe, but I can get that information back to you.
No,
I know
I'm just
it's
curious.
it's a handful of customers. It's
But
not
the-
a lot.
But to make sure that if I'm not misunderstanding you, this is important, and one of the things is that part of this time of use was designed to protect the Hoover power. So when we had less energy uses, you didn't want somebody to come in like now would be more like a data center. And it has a really large power source, and they're gonna take all the Hoover.
They'd have to negotiate that with the city.
Right. So then now the residents, now they're taking the power, so it's complicated. But these are type of things that you definitely have to understand and discuss to go forward to make sure. But you need something to actually discourage or say, if you want to come to Boulder City, okay, but you're going to pay for it. You can't you're not going to come to Boulder City to get Hoover power. And so that's the thing you got to do.
Yeah, data centers are something that, Joe and I were talking about this at lunch. The number one thing with somebody like a data center coming in is to protect your existing ratepayers. And what I mean by that is that basically they're not going to get any Hoover Dam. They're going to get the market price of power and the market price of capacity. All of those would be pass-through charges to them. And of course, you get your distribution fee, but basically you get a small amount of margin. But what you're doing is bringing your risk down. Because a data center, especially, some of these data centers we price have been 100 megawatt facilities. And your rate base could not take on that kind of risk.
No.
And I would not want, if they want to locate it in Boulder City, that's great. It's not going to provide that many jobs anyway. So there's not a huge incentive for them to locate here. They're going to locate here because of the power supply cost. But it needs to be market-based. And they wouldn't get any of the Hoover, the way I would structure the contract.
No, and thank you very much. That's
Yeah.
the reason I'm saying it's important. So maybe I misunderstood you, Mike, but these are important to understand because we need to understand how you are, look at each customer base.
So just to jump back to this one, moving water, that we only do have one customer that's at this rate at this voltage, and that's Cascada.
Okay.
So that's the only customer we have that's more than 2,400 volts at this time of use.
Doesn't SNWA pump on our,
They are an NV Energy customer,
even inside our city limit?
right?
Okay.
That's my understanding. I know we've got a backup feed to them at Pump Station 7, but their feed is either through CRC or Nevada Power, NV Energy.
How do they differ from our golf courses? As far as, you say they have a 2,400 volt supply,
Yeah,
but our golf courses, I mean, why are they, why do they, and our golf courses don't?
right. I believe it's just based on how they're designed with the water features that they have
Is it
and
the
the,
features that,
I imagine that that's,
the waterfall and,
yeah, the amount of,
or to pump water that high up?
yeah,
maybe?
yep, that's what
Oh, okay, that kind of makes sense.
So ours are gravity fed, I'm assuming. Most of the golf course could be gravity fed.
And they're up so high that they probably have to pump it
Yep.
up there. Okay, that makes sense.
Just curious, the pumping zones, do they pay for the additional pumping?
all the water domestically is gravity fed, so we don't have any additional pumping like on
Oh,
the
I thought
distribution side. This is beyond the meter.
Oh, gotcha, okay, okay.
So we've run over your time
That's
that you
okay.
anticipated, so if you, how much time do you,
I just want to, there's only couple more slides. There's a few I skipped over because we talked about, but there's a couple more I just want to just go back to. The first one I want to mention is this one. This is on time of use. And it just gives a picture of why we want to go to time of use. If you look at the blue line on this, this is a utility that charges on average 9.5 cents per kilowatt hour. But if a customer uses energy at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's only costing us 6 cents, but we're charging them 9.5. We're actually overcharging them. But then at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it's costing us 13.5 cents, but we're only charging them 9.5. So we're undercharging them. And so it's a matter of trying to send this price signal to customers so they can take advantage of the low costs that we have at 2 a.m. and try to discourage usage at 2 p.m. in the afternoon, in this example. So that's what time of use can do for you in the long term.
But it costs us a fortune to convert our systems to do something like that, correct?
AMI,
Yeah, we have a pilot program with AMI that's in there now for about 75 meters, and we're moving towards a long-term AMI strategy.
I mean, with this 5-year plan, it's not in the contract to study that, is it? And-
What 5-year plan?
Well, I mean, his company is gonna come up with a 5-year plan, right?
No, Mark's here just doing a training.
Oh, I thought
workshop.
it was his company that
No.
is probably gonna get the contract.
No,
Oh, I'm
just-
sorry,
Yep.
okay.
if you want, Michael, vote for us. Thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna go to look back and see what that company was and see if it was yours, but
Yeah.
I couldn't find it quick enough. But, I mean,
Whoops.
is that something that they're gonna look at? Is that gonna be in the
Yeah,
contract?
This is part of our normal studies. We, back about 5 years ago, we modified all of our cost of service studies so that they're all marginally cost-based, driven on power supply and transmission. So basically, this cost differential comes out of the study.
Oh, it does come out, okay.
Yeah.
but I think the thing that, so hopefully, because we do have to be a little careful how we do it, but by understanding this training, then we understand, it'll help us to understand in July, I'm thinking, what we need to push for the RFP.
Yeah, but of course, it all depends on what it would take to convert everything over to this time-based,
Yeah, but right now.
I mean, that's unrealistic for the city, isn't it?
Correct. For this iteration, yeah, we wouldn't be looking at time of use.
At all,
For this go-around, no.
for this 3-year study or whatever it is.
Correct.
Correct, okay.
This is going to sound weird what I'm going to say next, just so you understand. To identify the cost for time of use is the easy part. Implementing time of use is the difficult part.
Yeah.
Even from my perspective, because as a board of directors, I can say, oh, this is the cost-based rate charge residential. Well, if you approved what I did and you went out and implemented it, you're going to have some customers' bills are going to double and some customers are going to be cut in half. And you know what's happened to your telephone after that? So I mean, you have to go through that process of, it's extensive of analysis. because you have to say, okay, where is the blend where I minimize the impacts as much as possible, but still send the price signal? Then develop a plan or a phase-in over several years to structure it from where you are to the first phase, to the second phase and third phase. Lansing, Michigan, 100,000 customers 2 years ago. We put all the residential customers on TEMUs. They were charging like 13 cents a kilowatt hour flat for residential. We moved the on-peak to 15 and the off-peak down to 12 to move slowly. And then the next year we did another step, and we just keep doing that. And that's what I'd recommend. Give customers time to adapt.
But I think overall, when we're looking at the cost and what we'd want to do, that's great information to say, okay, to study it or to explain it shouldn't cost that much. To implement it is completely different. But if we're saying that, okay, we're going to implement it over years, or maybe in the 10-year period, we want to think about it, it's not bad to start thinking about it now.
Well, you said they have a program,
Yeah.
75 customers, right?
But
So
still,
it's- you'll get information from that that's probably pretty valuable.
We will, hopefully after the peak of this season is when we want to have it done, the peak demand. So before the end of this summer, we want to have
Are those
data.
customers aware of that?
They will be, yeah.
But, I mean, are they aware now? Are they changing their habits because of it? Their power usage habits because of they're in this program, or?
No,
I mean,
no.
obviously, it's not gonna do anything, it's not
Their
gonna tell
meters,
you anything.
their meter's not going to change at all. It's just we're turning on a feature that's in their meter.
So they don't even know that they're being studied.
Correct.
Oh, well, that's great, yeah.
You could be in the study.
I could be, yeah. I find it interesting that when I lived in California in the late 80s, they had a program like that. And we could sign up for it, and and they said, don't use power in this time, it's gonna cost you this much if you use it over here, and it's gonna be cheaper now because you're in this program, and it was pretty successful, and that's a long time ago.
No, I think we're at a changing point, and so Mark has brought some great ideas up to as far as what we might want to look at our rate structures and stuff like that. So understanding a outline, understanding what we need to ask. I think that was the key thing in the last couple of rates is I don't believe we asked the right questions for the RFP. And so that's very important. And then once we do write the right questions, then we need to have the right time frames to get the right people together to say, okay, this is what you've done. Now, do we all understand it? What's your next recommendation? So there's several steps involved that need to be understood so we don't get caught up into a thing, well, that's not what you told me you wanted to do. And so, because I think we're really looking, the rate structures need to be looked at, and we haven't really looked at the rate structures for some time.
We can talk about it after. So, all right, I have everything. I want to thank you all for the questions, everything. Really appreciate it. It makes it so nice when you got interaction like that. Thank you. So,
Well, thank you for your time and your
thank
extra
you.
time. Greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, Joe, did you have any other comments on this?
No, nothing follow up. So I hope the committee, received the information and you have that some time to digest it before the next meeting, which I believe is July 2nd.
Okay,
So-
yeah, so just remind everybody, the calendar on the city still has it as the 9th.
Yeah, I was gonna say that you were gonna change that, weren't you? I mean,
Yeah, we'll get the calendar
Yeah, because as of
changed
yesterday,
to
it was still the
reflect
ni- it was still the 9th.
the 2nd.
Thought Josh sent out that.
yeah, that's what I thought you did, but was it changing to the 2nd or from the 2nd? I'm trying to. It was to the 2nd. Oh, okay.
Yes, and that's what we
That was
agreed to
because
in
of
our
the-
last meeting, so I just want to clarify so we all come on the 2nd, not the 9th.
Yep. Yeah, we'll have the calendar updated.
Okay, that's great. I think that was so really quickly, I think we can still do it on this rate base. So on the agenda for the 2nd, we're talking about what we believe and what the city believes is needed for the RFP. Is that correct?
I don't think we could talk too much about that, but yeah,
I'm
that's,
just trying to make sure we understand. We're not debating it. We're not discussing it. We're just making sure that that's what the agenda item is for the next meeting.
I'd have to go back and look in the minutes, but yeah, but that's my understanding.
Okay, just making sure. Because this is a great lead into that, and I just want to make sure we didn't misunderstand that.
Yeah.
So, okay. So then, does any of the committee members have anything else on on this training, on the agenda item number 1, before I close it out?
I was curious, though, what's the time frame for the RFP? I'm forgetting now exactly. Has it been, I mean, the contract hasn't been put out yet, correct?
No, the RFP will go out in July.
It does go out in July.
Yep, it will go out in July, and the goal is to have, the study, cost of service, rate structure prepared for fiscal years 27 through 29.
And if it's going out in July, are we going to have any input at all, or, I mean?
Yes, at the next meeting.
Oh, so you can change it I mean, it sounds like if it's going out in July, there's only about 28 days where if we meet on the 2nd, where you actually, you still could change it all the way up to the time that you actually submit it, then.
We're gonna take input from the committee.
Uh-huh.
After the July 2nd meeting, we're gonna put out the RFP after that.
Oh, okay, so you can change pretty easily. It's not.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Any other comments on the agenda item number 1? Okay, so we'll close out the agenda item 1, and we will go to the second public comment. And it's on the screen now. So again, there's nothing was emailed or phoned in. Okay, thank you. So it's, we'll go to the phones, 702-589-9629. And again, this can be done doesn't have to be an agenda item, but related to utilities, of course. We'll give just a minute or two, not too long, to. Just give it another 30 seconds and then we'll call it good. Okay, so we'll close out the second public comment period. I want to thank everybody for their time and their patience and their questions. And we'll see everybody back here at 1 o'clock on July